I continue to read the biography of Isaiah Berlin, A Life by Michael Ignatieff. Chapter 13, Cold War, 1949 to 1953. In January 1949, Berlin took up the first of a quarter century of a part-time appointment at American universities. Just as he had to make his peace with Israel, so he had to make his peace with America. He was attached to the Russian Research Center at Harvard, and besides pursuing his own research on the Russian intelligentsia, was supposed to teach an undergraduate course on Russian thought. Maurice Baura, who had been at Harvard a short time earlier, giving the Norton lectures, wrote Isaiah a teasing letter about his instructional duties. Quote, "In that admirable publication, Courses of Instruction, page 161, under International and Regional Studies, I see that Mr. Berlin of Oxford University will lecture on the development of revolutionary ideas on Russia on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9. Now, 9 in this country means 9 a.m., and Monday is Monday all the world over. No doubt you have given thought to this, but I feel it may be my duty to point it out." For the middle-aged Oxford don, used to the semi-ecclesiastical splendor of college dinners, it must have been a lowering experience to stand in line with a tray in the Lowell House cafeteria in a queue of teenager Americas. At first, Isaiah was miserable. He struggled through his lecture course in an agony of self-consciousness, avoiding the serried satires of his listeners and fixing his eyes on the ceiling over their heads. He burrowed into Weidner Library, dug deep into Russian sources, but missed London society, and after the excitement of his Washington years, felt that Cambridge, Massachusetts, was flat and monochromatic. His students didn't seem to know how to read or write, at least not as these activities are understood at our best universities. Their thoughts came out higgledy-piggledy from the buzzing, booming confusion of their minds. The worst seemed deaf to irony, while the best seemed beset with guilt. He thought their guilt about the uselessness of the art and the scholarship was just another form of Philistinism. The contrast between the tormented moral language of the Russian intellectuals he was reading about in Weidner and the blandly psychological discourse of the eager young American undergraduates he met at dinner in Lowell House gave him food for thought. They seemed baffled by the idea that life's essential problems might not always be solvable. The more Berlin thought about it, the more they seemed to be a central symptom of the age. "All misery or evil is considered," he wrote, "as a bad state, a species of psychological malaise, needing in the first place a remedy." But this was to misunderstand what made life worth living. When this culture of therapy was linked to energetic social welfarism in Attlee's Britain and Truman's America, the result was a soulless social conformity. Something was germinating in his mind, but for the moment he registered only the dreariness of a post-war American academy. His colleagues at the Russian Research Center spent their time deducting unexciting conclusions from devils and suspect material. In letters to E. H. Carr and Alan Bullock, Isaiah wrote scathingly about the positivist pedantry of American social science. He probably had not read much of it, but this did not prevent him from remarking that the American academics wrote with all the grace of a deep-sea diver sitting down to a dinner party. As the months passed, he made friends and his spirits lifted. As in London, his social acumen never deserted him. The grandest Boston hostesses, Mrs. Warren and Mrs. Chandler, invited him to their afternoon teas. Unlike London, where talk at a society dinner table was often racy and amusing, Boston high society talk was a parody of Henry James. He had more to say to Murray Fensold, the Harvard political scientist, who specialized in the governance of the Soviet Union, the great Italian scholar and anti-fascist hero, Gaetano Salvemini, then working in the next office in Widener Library. Irving Singer, a young philosophy graduate student, Eliot Perkins, master of a Lowell House, Perry Miller, the brilliant author of The New England Mind, and Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a young American historian just achieving fame for his Age of Jackson. Schlesinger, whom Berlin had first met in Washington during the war, became a close friend. They were both gregarious liberals, avid for gossip and intrigue, impatient with the academy, fascinated with power and influence. On every available weekend, he took the train down to Washington to revisit his old haunts. In just 3 years, the atmosphere in the city had changed. The Churchill-Roosevelt Grand Alliance was just a memory. Truman and Attlee had quarreled openly about Palestine, and Britain's fall from grace in American eyes was only too evident. In places of the naive self-confidence that Isaiah had so admired, there was a new mood of morose self-doubt about the communist threat. In January 1949, communist troops seized Peking, and by midsummer, most of China was in communist hands. In Washington, who lost China was the question of the hour, and the hunt for scapegoats, fellow travelers, Marxist intellectuals, spies in government agencies was already underway. Berlin's old friends were gloomy and, in Joe Alsop's case, convinced that the Republic's days were numbered. Disaster had overtaken Edward Pritchard. He had been convicted for ballot stuffing in a Democratic election in Kentucky in 1948, and despite the intercession of his powerful Washington friends, had lost his appeal and was serving time in a federal penitentiary. He wrote pungent letters to Isaiah, admitting his guilt and lamenting the hubris of youth. In May 1949, Isaiah traveled out to Wellfleet on Cape Cod to renew his acquaintance with the critic Edmund Wilson. Berlin had admired Axel's Castle, and the two men had first met over lunch at the Princeton Club in New York. In the spring of 1946, Isaiah was fascinated by Wilson's appearance. Thick-set, red-faced, pot-bellied, not unlike President Hoover, and by his extraordinary vehemence. He spoke in curiously strangled voice, with gaps between his sentences, as if ideas jostled and thrashed about inside him. Berlin thought Wilson's political ideas were sometimes mad. For example, his intransigent isolationism during the war, but he admired his intellectual seriousness and the fearless way he plunged into new language, Hebrew and Russian, for example. When setting off on a new project, Wilson was intrigued by Berlin's double Russian and British personality, and by the end of a breathless weekend of a non-stop argument, interspersed with some heavy drinking by Wilson, they had become enduring friends. Before he returned to England that summer, Isaiah gave a lecture at Mount Holyoke College in eastern Massachusetts on democracy, communism, and the individual. He had warmed to American undergraduates and was now writing to English friends about how agreeable it was to sit like a bishop at confirmation surrounded by hundreds of very serious young women in blue jeans, moccasins, and white socks. They reminded him of the Russian intellectual women of 1880, who, when asked what they did, replied, "I walk and think." The root of communism, he told these serious young women, lay in the 18th century belief, expressed in its most extreme form by Rousseau, that there was one right way for human beings to live. This belief, he went on, denies that different ideas of life might not be altogether reconcilable with each other. Liberty, equality, and fraternity, for example, were beautiful but incompatible. Communism had inherited its faith, and Stalin's engineers of human souls had sought to mold human beings into identical shapes. This same utopian temptation also threatened Western democracies, wherever planners believed that there must be one answer for all questions, and wherever experts conceived of a society as one vast hospital, and interpreted all human discontent as a maladjustment. Democracy, he told the undergraduates, did not mean rule by planners and experts, but by citizens.